What I was hitting.
It's right now.
No, it's not moving.
You're hitting back.
Oh. Okay, user error. Okay, here we go. Okay, so what I'd like to do is start by just asking you to answer a couple of questions, just so you get a sense of the group. So if you're on Zoom, please answer the poll. Ellie, if you'll just put up that poll, or people will have it on their Zoom. But if just in here, if I could just get a sense of how many folks have ever observed or been observed using an observation protocol? Okay. And have you ever participated in a training to use an observation protocol? So we have a fair sampling of that. And how do we look on the poll?
Question 1, 14 yes, 4 no. And question 2, 12 yes, and 6 no.
Okay. All right. So we have a fair good bit of familiarity, and that's great. All right. So what I'd like to do is first talk about how classroom observation measures have really emerged over the last quarter century. And there was hope that they could really change how we worked with teachers, how we understood teachers, and specifically one of the goals was to provide the field with a common language, a common vision for describing teaching practice. A second was to enhance research and the study of teaching. And then with the press for accountability measures, the idea was, could this contribute to supporting valid and consequential decisions about teacher quality? And finally, I think the larger goal, although not always realized, was to support the professional development of teaching by identifying particular areas of teaching that needed improvement. Now, this work actually came out of this attraction to observation protocols was generated from a variety of forces, one being sort of a historic dissatisfaction with observation practices. And those go back way back to the beginning of professional teaching. We had practices that were seen to be idiosyncratic and pretty much uninformative, in that most teachers received the same sort of scores. They were seen as bureaucratic kinds of activities, and they didn't contribute much. And then we saw an emergence of teacher effectiveness research that used student test scores as the determinant of teaching quality. And so we had these things called value-added scores, growth models. And those models could sort teachers or rank them on this metric that was developed, but it couldn't explain why they differed or the effectiveness of their teaching in terms of raising student test scores. And it wasn't actionable in any particular way. And for those reasons, as well as measurement characteristics, both educators and many researchers were highly suspicious of these value-added scores. So there was an attraction to observation measures because they were seen as potentially being direct measures of instruction that had the potential to be reliable, explanatory, actionable, and credible. Now, in order for them to sort of meet those aspirations, they had to satisfy two basic conditions of measurement. They needed to be reliable and they needed to be valid. And so when we think about reliability, what we're saying is, and particularly in this context, we're looking at the reliability of those who observe practice. We want it to be a matter of indifference whether I observe the teacher or Ravita observes the teacher. They should get the same score when we're looking at that practice. And the other thing that we were concerned about is that these scores should be valid, that they should reflect the quality of teaching that we're looking at and not other kinds of factors that might influence the scores that we give. So the results over years of study are that they aren't that great. And the illustrious Brittany Marshall, I think she might be on the call here, and I wrote a chapter that's going to be in the Handbook of Ed Policy Research that reviews a lot of this work. And what we found is that despite all sorts of efforts, people working diligently trying to improve the quality of measurement, it sort of didn't, it has sort of been in a particular place. We know the kinds of reliability metrics we're likely to get, and regardless of changing the recruiting, the training, how we design the protocols, we tend to get very stable kinds of measures. The other thing that we saw is that scores are going to vary for a variety of reasons that are not necessarily related to teaching performance. So for example, we've seen that black teachers receive lower scores than one would expect in these observation protocols when you account for all the factors that of the classroom and the conditions of the teaching. We also find that teachers of students with lower achievement histories also receive lower scores than you'd expect. And then there's this other issue of what happens when you move these protocols from research environments into practice. And here we find that, in fact, real differences there. So in practice, scores tend to be much higher than they are in research studies, and for good reasons. I mean, it's that we can go into in another context. But we also find that principals, if you give them a bunch of observations to look at, videos, you'll see that they rate the teachers that they know that are in their schools higher than the teachers who they don't know, right? So there's a lot of things that are affecting the scores that we give, and all those things make the interpretation of scores problematic. Now, this has created great consternation by the part of researchers who have been working on this, and they've been really frustrated. And you can see this in the next slide. So these are people at various points in their career who have all been bummed out. And so in today's talk, what I'd like to do is work on conveying a message so that they're not as sad as they look. Okay, so what we what I want to do is start with this idea that it's sort of an immutable truth that we are not going to achieve more reliable measures of teaching quality using classroom observation measures. But paradoxically, particularly from a measurement person like myself, I think these measures collectively offer the field significant potential to improve teaching. But to do this is going to require a reframing of the problem and an understanding of both the inherent limits of what we have tried to do and the potential of what we can do. And so today what I'd like to do is lay out a set of principled reasons grounded in human psychology that have helped me understand why the results we have found are and should have been entirely predictable. And I wanted to, we have lots of students here, so I want to kind of give a plug for being a graduate student. The work that I'm going to be talking about here goes back to stuff that I studied many, many decades ago in graduate school. And I was a cognitive psychologist, and the work that I've done in the ensuing years has been a significant departure from what I did in graduate school. And yet, what I learned is resurfacing in significant kinds of ways, and in sometimes unexpected ways. So I guess, if there's a message, it is that, get deep into the work you're doing, but don't be afraid to explore in different directions. But this work that you're doing, whatever that field is, I think has long-lasting effects. It might be implicit, it might be explicit, but the stuff that you do always sort of manifests itself in different curious kinds of ways. So even with these scores of limited measurement quality using traditional psychometric standards, a great deal has been learned about teaching, and I'm going to get into that a little later in the talk. Okay, so let's start with observation protocols. For many of you, this is going to be familiar. This is the Danielson framework, and this is a structure by which we look at teaching, right? So we have protocols are organized in higher level domains. So in Danielson, it's planning and preparation, classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibilities. And then within each of those domains, there's a set of dimensions. If you were just going to look at teaching, you'd only look at domains. And if you were only looking at an actual classroom, you'd consider domains 2 and 3. Domain 1 looks at lesson planning kinds of things, and domain 4 looks at other kinds of evidence. Now, other protocols, most of them have this kind of structure: a larger domain structure, the big constructs that you're looking at, and then some smaller, lower level dimensions. And then underneath that are some elements that contribute to those dimensions as well, and I'll show you that. So this is a generic structure, and to actually conduct the observation process, I'm doing two things at once here. This is the general process by which one proceeds. First, observers have to learn the protocol, right? They have to understand the dimensions, the domains, what they mean, what the scale points are, what the evidence you'd be looking for is to determine, to arrive at your judgment. You have to learn how to record evidence, right? You're watching a classroom and you're recording evidence in certain ways. And each protocol describes that process a little bit differently. And then you have to assign evidence to particular dimensions that you're looking at, right? So that gets complicated. Then you got to synthesize all of this into saying, okay, here's the evidence I have about this particular dimension or that particular dimension, and I need to assign a score there. And so you do that. And then particularly in research studies, we engage in monitoring and calibration. We want to know, so to what extent are the observers giving similar kinds of scores? Are they in line with what we want, the scores that match sort of expert scorers, which who tend to be the developers of the protocol? And we go through a set of processes to try to keep all of that in line. And so all of that really came back to me as these are two fundamental psychological processes underway. One is categorization and one is decision making. And there's a long history of research about those two processes. So we have to categorize, we have to identify information in the classroom as evidence of teaching. So we have to notice things, right? There's a ton of stuff. It's a hugely complicated environment. And you got to pick out things. Like, what are you going to notice, right? I mean, do you pay attention to the clock? Probably not. But, do you pay attention to the clothes the kids are wearing? Probably not. But maybe you are implicitly, and that's a problem. But, so you're filtering lots of information in this huge stimulating environment, and you're elevating certain things too, saying, oh, this is evidence I want to pay attention to. And then you have to take all of that and classify that as particular interactions as evidence relative to one or more dimensions. And then you got a whole bunch of decision making that has to happen too. And that decision making involves weighting. So here is one dimension rubric for Danielson. It's cultivating respectful and affirming environments. So it's one of these 20 dimensions that are rated. But inside of that, I don't know if you can see it, but there are four indicators within that. So one, if we're looking at to what extent is that classroom cultivating a respectful and affirming environment, we want to look at positive relationships, a sense of belonging, cultural responsiveness, and positive conflict resolution. Okay. Now, these protocols don't give you any real guidance on how to weight that evidence. They might say, think about the preponderance of evidence. They might say sort of average things, but there's no real guidance in how to make that judgment. So the people who are observing have to do a lot of work. And so the idea that there's all this categorization that happens and all this complex decision making, it's a daunting goal if we're shooting for reliable scores of teaching in this highly complex context. And so it's no wonder that we haven't gotten much more consistent scoring. And here I'm going to now delve into what we know about categorization and decision making. So, you know, we start with categorization. We do this from infancy on, right? We see stimulus, we see entities, we have experiences, and whether it's familiar or novel, we try to categorize it, right? So we say this instance is a category of something. So here, it's pretty simple, right? Which is a bird. I assume a good proportion of us here could get that right. And kids are doing this, and this is how we learn. We build structures, right? We do all of this. Okay, but then it gets a little trickier because when we look at when we think about how people actually form categories, there are some things that are clear rules, right? We think, well, we have rules. This belongs to this category. This belongs to that category. But in essence, in most categories, it's very probabilistic, right? There's that we have, it's a robin is more birdish than a penguin is, right? And it's much harder to decide that a bat isn't a bird than a robin, or that a pig isn't a bird, right? So we see these kinds of differences that are even in what we call natural categories. And these natural categories are categories that reflect the real world, right? We have animals, plants, colors. They're discrete, and if they're one thing, they're discrete, and in that, if they're one thing, they're not the other thing. But mostly what we have are artificial categories. They're created by human beings, right? And these artificial categories are messier. And what I showed you was a natural category and the messiness of that. But when we have an artificial category, they're particularly messy because they overlap, they intersect, they can be conditional and idiosyncratic. So for example, if I ask you, is a 7-year-old a youth or not, most of us would say, yeah, that's a youth. But if I say it's a 17-year-old, is that a youth? Is it a teenager? Is it an adult? And my answer may be very conditional on the particular context in which I'm asking that, right? And we see that now, if you think about what we're doing in these protocols, we see that very significantly. Okay, so categories are learned in multiple kinds of ways. There are bottom-up processes in which we have lots of experiences, and we build them up, and we build up these categories. But then there are also these top-down processes in which we're given rules and explanations, and we build these categories. And in learning these categories, prior knowledge can both be a help or a hindrance. So they help in that we know these things. We say, oh, this is like that other thing, and we bring that in, and we broaden our sense of what that category is. But it can also hinder, and we say, I have these categories, I'm fitting this in, but it really isn't part of that category. And so we see those kinds of problems as well. And when people learn new categories, they learn these new artificial categories, they learn them very unevenly. And a lot of the research was done with, you know, sort of lab-like tasks with shapes and these kinds of things. But we're now talking about a very complex teaching phenomenon, and it can take a lot of time and a lot of difficulty to actually learn what those categories are. And so now let's think about these observation protocols in terms of what we're doing. Every one of them is an explicit theory of categorization, right? And even though we pretty much have a shared sense of the major features that belong in these protocols, there's something around cognitive activation, there's something about relationships, there's something about organization. How those are actually done in these protocol schemes is very idiosyncratic. And the evidence of that is there's like hundreds of these observation protocols. So if there was a truth, there'd be one, but there's not one. There's a lot of them, right? And so, and what we also do is in these protocols, like in Danielson, you know, we have 20 of these protocols, and we treat them as separate, unique dimensions, right? But they're not, and they overlap a lot. They come together, and in interesting ways. And so we build these structures of domains and dimensions, and each one being unique because they help us communicate, they help us for measurement, but they don't reflect the categorization scheme that people bring into that situation, right? And so, so if I say to yourself, if I say, you know, I'm looking at a classroom discussion, and this is a particular instance of students' argumentation. I can do that and say, okay, I'm going to click that box for argumentation. But is it not also a measure of classroom organization and relationships and all sorts of other, right? And the instructional content, right? There's a bunch of things going on, but we have sort of artificially said, put it in this box because we got to manage this observation that we're doing. Okay. And so, I also want to think about developing these protocols. Now, has anybody been involved in the development of the protocols? Okay, a couple of you. All right, so you know how gnarly it is, right? So what we do is you sit down with a bunch of researchers and educators, and you try to say, we want to develop a protocol about, you know, Sharon did an early childhood one, or, you know, maybe it's one about mathematics, or maybe it's different subjects, or maybe it's about culturally responsive teaching. And what you wind up doing is you look at tens, if not hundreds of videos, and you're trying to work this through, and you have lots of debates and fights about this stuff, and you're saying, well, no, it should be in this category, in that category, maybe we should separate these out. This is evidence for this is evidence for that. You do all this stuff, right? And you're working like crazy, and finally you say, okay, we've got it. We have truth, right? And so we've gone through all this, and now we have our final protocol. And then we share it with observers as if this was obvious and true and, like, you know, not a problem. Of course this is the way it should be. And not only that, but we tell them, you've got to use this thing the way it is. You have to use the lens of the protocol. I've used these words myself, trust me. And we don't, you know, don't bring all your stuff, because that's bias. We want you to just use that structure. And we then say, and by the way, you need to learn this in a couple of days, and we'll give you maybe 5 to 10 videos to look at to do this. Well, there's nothing that we know about how humans interact, how they categorize, how they make decisions, that suggests any of this would work beyond what we have found in our data. Okay, so what I want to do is kind of look at some of this, how people categorize and make decisions in other contexts, because we should have known about this. So this Ashton looked at meta-analyses in a variety of fields and said, basically, would somebody make the same decision if they used the same evidence at different times? So they had these professional judgments where they looked at people who were experts, professionals in these particular areas. They did this for a living, whatever this was. And they made judgments on 2 sets of data even within the same session, or 2 sessions separated by a few days or a couple of weeks. So it's the same data, same people making the judgments. And then and they were given data profiles. So they're given like sets of information, test information, diagnostic information. They're not actually doing what we ask observers to do in classroom observation, of actually creating that data. Okay, so it's a simpler task in some ways than what we ask people to do. Okay, so here are these, here's what Ashton reported. So meteorology, the idea was, could I decide whether there's going to be a hailstorm or not based on data? Auditing might be, what were the fiscal controls in an organization? Medicine was the looking at the basically biopsy information and how serious was a cancer. Clinical psychology, I think they were looking at hyperactivity. Okay, so now remember, this is the same data looking at the same time or close to the same time. And even here, people rated things differently in terms of where they would put this particular rating. Hailstorms, I guess, were in pretty good shape, but after that, it gets shakier. And then when we look at the agreement between raters, it's much less, right? And in clinical psychology, probably the closest to our field, it's pretty modest, okay? And these are people who are experts, who have been doing this for a year, not observers who've been trained on a few days to do this sort of thing. And so what I took from this is that highly experienced judges don't necessarily make the same judgment about the same information. And the greater the delay between judging samples, the lower the reliability. There was also huge inter-judge variation. So there were some judges who, in each of these fields, save meteorology, who were pretty inconsistent in judging the same set of information. And what they found, not unexpectedly, is that the reliability of pooled judges, if you take the information together, that reliability was much stronger than reliability of single judges. Now, you'd expect that out of measurement theory, but that is a key piece of why the findings from research studies have been useful, because they typically are pooled over multiple judges and multiple samples, right? It's not a single observation or a handful of observations by one person trying to make a judgment. So he also looked at wine judgments. Whoops, I'm sorry, I didn't show you that one. This was the data. And we also looked at wine judgments. I got to be better on this. Now, wine judgments were very poor, and but I want to kind of, again, this is a professional tip here. One domain that academics like to study is wine tasting, and because they're trying to mix business and pleasure, right? And in fact, there's a journal of wine economics, because economists they like wine, but they just can't enjoy the wine. Right? You know, because, I mean, think about it. You don't go like and say, I'm having a wine party, make sure I have enough economists here. But probably you'd say the same thing about psychometricians. So for those of you who've spent money on wine and listened to wine connoisseurs talk about the wine structure, its acidity, its tannins, nose, they're all experts, right? And yet their reliability is about 0.5 of, when I say their reliability, their intra-reliability. That is giving them the same wine from the same bottle and asking them to make judgments. And their inter-rater reliability is about 0.34. So it's pretty, you know, maybe don't spend as much as you have been on the wine. And if you were wondering, white wines are more reliable than red wines. So, okay. So I want to turn to weighting and decision making now, right? So one of the things that we know about is that we learned, again, many, many years ago, is that experts are inconsistent not because they have different models of how things operate and what's important, but they have different ways of weighting things. They say certain things are more or less important. And so what we found, what has been found over multiple domains over many years, is that experts are very good at identifying, selecting, coding, and describing key features in a domain. But once they integrate that information, it's much less consistent. different experts weigh different features differently, and that results in unreliable decision-making. And I mean, think about just looking at a movie review or a book review or a food review, and you'll see that play out, right? People may have very similar, they may structure the review similarly and talk about similar attributes, and even have similar senses of those attributes, but then come down to very different conclusions about the quality. Okay, so Robin Dawes did a lot of this work. Robin Dawes did a lot of this work. And what he argued is that you are much better off taking, let me go back here. You're much better off using an algorithm, actually doing mathematically weighing the different attributes that experts give and coming to a total score than having the experts make those judgments. Not only is it more reliable, it's also more valid. So they did this over many fields, many different domains. And so he argued that by not doing this algorithmic weighting of taking each of these individual scores and weighting it, but letting experts weigh this, it was, he argued that it was inappropriate and unethical. So he said, no matter how much we would like to see this or that aspect of one or another of the studies reviewed in this article changed, no matter how psychologically uncompelling or distasteful we may find the results to be, no matter how ethically uncomfortable we may feel at reducing people to mere numbers, the fact remains that our clients are people who deserve to be treated in the best manner possible. If that means, as it appears at present, that selection, diagnosis, and prognosis should be based on nothing more than the addition of a few numbers representing values on important attributes, so be it. To do otherwise is cheating the people we serve. Now, he recognized at that time, and I think it's fair to say at this time, that many experts, and particularly people in this field, would not find that acceptable. So it's contested terrain, but this, I thought I'd share it just as a view of somebody who comes from a view of fairness rooted in empiricism. Okay. So now issues of weighting, as I mentioned earlier, have largely been swept under the rug when we study observation protocols. Do we weight different features of something we encounter? How do we weight those things when we make a summary judgment? In most of the protocols we judge, they include multiple features. And again, we look at this Danielson feature. There's no guidance given, and so we leave observers to their own devices to make these weighting decisions. And these observers are not expert decision makers in this particular context either. Given that experts have a very difficult time integrating information from multiple features, our failure to give this aspect of scoring by non-experts far more serious attention than we've done is one more source of predictable scoring inconsistency. So taking into account all of this, we were naive that we could ever obtain reliable scores under typical research conditions. And so we're asking novice judges, right, to score complex classrooms with artificial and idiosyncratic categorization schemes, minimal training, and here we haven't even touched on what we call occasion variance. You know, in all these models, we're trying to get a stable trait of teachers. We're trying to say, is this a good teacher? What's their quality, right? But there's occasion variance. We don't expect all classes within a unit to look the same, right? We don't expect, we may, in a science classroom, we may have more discussion early in a unit and later in a unit. But when they're actually doing some experiments, they may not be discussing much at all. That's a natural kind of ebb and flow of the classroom, and we don't take that into account, that kind of thing, but that affects the reliability of our measures as well. Okay, so we have had lots of, as I mentioned, because we can design studies particular ways, there have been lots of contributions of these observation methods. I'll just do that quickly. We've developed theory. We've developed protocols that have broadened our view of teaching, including being looked at students in looking at cultural responsive teaching, teaching of students with learning new languages, protocols that can be applied across countries and cultures. We've been able to look at the features of the observations that are problematic, and we've been able to understand context a little bit better as well. So I don't want to, especially when I talk to those depressed people, we've made lots of progress. But I want to shift gears here and talk about using these protocols as supports for learning. And to date, the evidence has been mixed. In efforts where these protocols have been, observation systems have been instituted, let's say district-wide, there hasn't been significant changes in outcomes. I want to argue that the link between the protocols we've designed to observe teachers has been largely a black box, and its use formatively has largely been a black box. And it's been a black box that's left in the hands of coaches who use the information from these protocols. So the diagnosis that we have doesn't exactly translate to prescription. So let me give you a quick analog. Say you're getting old and your knee starts to hurt. This is just a hypothetical. So you go to a doctor and they take an x-ray, they manipulate you, and they say you should go to a physical therapist. And so you go to the physical therapist, and the physical therapist, they have a program of what to do with this kind of person. It didn't come out of that diagnosis particularly. That diagnosis didn't tell you, here's the therapy. They did it. And they also, so they have you do a bunch of knee exercises, but they may also have you do a bunch of core exercises because they understand how the system all works together, right? So there's this whole theory of what you do to improve things that doesn't come out of the diagnostic test, which is kind of what this observation protocol, as we've designed it, is. So we need to have more better professional models that support teachers. And specifically, I think we need to restructure our observation protocols to be used for formative approaches. They need to, you know, as I mentioned, we've separated these dimensions into these artificial categories, but when we have to bring them back together in ways when we think about using them formatively. We need theories of learning for how teachers develop. The protocols we have are very flat. They don't say how people progress, what things you should attend to first or last. There's all this, it's just 20 numbers out of Danielson, or some other protocol will have similar kinds of things. But there's no theory of learning that's embedded within any of that. So we're going to have to get that as well. And so let me give you a quick example. So this is competitive football players. For Pablo, that's soccer. That's soccer, okay. Okay. So, and you can see that this is organized similarly to what we would see in a observation protocol. There's 4 domains here: tactical, physical, technical, and mental. And you see this common across all, they have tons of these kinds of schemes. And then you have a set of dimensions inside of that, okay? And there's actually far more dimensions inside of each one of these things. But what they do is they also have other models. And so here, this is oops, shoot. Where am I? Okay, I'm sorry, this was that. And this is the, so this is the development model. And this shows you how skills develop, right? So what we see here are things like tactical skills only develop, are only introduced at the U13 level, right? And so, so this differs from our protocols, our observation protocols, in that there is a progression and an identification of what skills should be attended to at different points in development. And then they also have another set of tools, and that describes the kinds of activities that one would have, the kinds of engagements that one would have at different levels to promote those skills. And these are integrated kinds of things, right? They're not just saying, let's just focus on one of those dimensions in each of those schemes. Now, I'm not suggesting that this model be applied directly to teacher professional development, but to have some sense of that there is pedagogical support to organize it at levels that make sense, and how to integrate skills and activities, and how to choose at different points of development are things that we need to develop. Okay, so we need to clarify effective formative processes that are based on observation protocols. What do those look like? So again, we need to restructure our protocols for formative approaches. We need to think about theories of learning, how they develop skills. We need to say who participates in these formative efforts. We haven't really talked about that as well. What other evidence besides the observation evidence ought to be brought into the mix when we engage in professional development? And what other tools, like AI tools, might be brought into the mix as well? These are all things that become interesting research projects as well. And we need a robust research agenda, specifically in that vein. We need to interrogate pedagogical theories. We need to look at the efficacy of formative approaches. We need to look at the nature of teacher learning and the dynamics of formative assessment. And then finally, we need to think about who we're trying to influence with any of these formative assessment processes. It's kind of the typical way of positioning this is that we're here to improve teachers. So we have an observer and a teacher, right, a facilitator and a teacher working one-on-one. But we can think about not only improving a single teacher, but what does it mean to improve observers, to improve the capacity of principals and administrators through this process? What does it mean to have communities of practice rather than identifying this is a teacher's weakness? What do we see as the goals across observations that we think we need to improve in a school or in a teacher ed program? Okay. So I want to turn to thinking about these protocols as tools for interrogation. And here I'm citing work that I've been doing along with Aaron Rabinowitz on a project that we've been involved in around a science protocol. And what we start with is we reject the assumption that the protocol contains the right and unassailable view of teaching. It's a model, but it's worth interrogating. And so we're asking what happens when the goal moves from reliability to shared understanding. And so we've worked with observers who are engaged in a protocol, a validation study of an observation protocol. And here, typically what we do with them is they score, 2 people score each observation, and then we come together and say we need to have a consensus score, right? But we challenged that and said, no, that's not it. We don't want to do the consensus score because during these consensus scores, we discovered a lot of richness of thinking that these people were exchanging, and we kind of pushed that aside because we're pursuing the reliability goal. But when we, so here instead of doing that, what we said is we want to have a discussion not to arrive at agreement, and we built a lot of this around work from Pamela Moss, who's done this work for a long time, who discussed how the pursuit of reliability could shut down dialogue and inquiry. And she showed through argumentation and discussion how portfolio scores of teachers could be far more meaningful for teachers as well as participants in the process than if standard measurement practices were the only methods used. So what we did is we said, so the purpose of these debriefing sessions is to share your evidence and interpret up to 3 dimensions that you score differently. But unlike the other work, this isn't a calibration exercise. We're particularly interested in learning more about how observers' understanding of quality science teaching changes through their discussion with colleagues after the observations. And so what they had to do was they each scored these observations independently. They met together with a research facilitator, and we selected 3 dimensions for discussion. Observer 1 would make the case for their score, followed by observer 2. And then they have an open discussion where they weren't trying to necessarily convince or win the argument. They were, there was no expectation of that. And the protocol then is used as a stimulus for this discussion, but they weren't necessarily constrained to only use that as well. They could bring other things into the mix in their discussion as well. So what I want to do is just show you a quick example, and we'll close with that, of what we did here. So here's 2 observers, John and Mary. One gave it a 4, one gave it a 2. And this is on inquiry this is on inquiry around a unit on, or a lesson on which they are, it's an engineering video. They're designing blades for a wind turbine. And so if this dimension focuses on science practices, to which it considers the extent to which students are authentically practicing science and engineering by thinking, reasoning, applying science and engineering concepts, and making decisions in ways similar to professional scientists or engineers. Okay, so the first observer gives this high rating and said even though most of the class was teacher-directed, there was a lot of engineering practice evidence when students worked in small groups. And I think you can see that. I tried to highlight some of those examples, right? Okay. So then Mary, she didn't disagree with that, but she's focusing much more on the whole class setting, which did take up the majority of the time in the class. So again, so now we see this weighting issue, right? They actually saw some things similarly, but they're weighting that differently within the protocol, using the protocol. But now where we get to is, but then the first observer elaborates what was done, and the second observer shows some vulnerability by noting that her teaching experience didn't include venturing into engineering classes, and begins to see some things she did not acknowledge on first seeing the video. But then, so that's one piece of learning that's happening here, and the ability to sort of be a little vulnerable here, right? And saying, you know, you have more experience in this particular domain, and if we think about observers, particularly administrators in schools, it's very likely they have limited knowledge of particular domains that they're looking at, or instruction that they're looking at. And so hearing from the teacher rather than telling the teacher might be quite informative. But she's also saying, you know, we're talking about this practices, but I think it's also relevant to this dimension of purpose. And they start talking about that and how these things fit together. It gives you insight into how the protocol might be structured, how these things unfold. But you're entering in, you're bringing in new information from these people. And invariably, when we did these interviews, people came walking away feeling that it was enriching by listening to their colleagues and hearing these sorts of things. But there was no push to say, we have to decide if this is a 3 or a 4 or a 2 or whatever it was. Okay, so when we look at the what we're trying to do here is we have a set of analytic questions that we're looking at when we analyze these data. One is, what's the nature of an alternative case? Are observers focused on different evidence? Are they engaging in different interpretation of the same evidence? Is there uncertainty and how it's represented? What personal experiences do observers bring to their argument? How do the perspectives change if they do? What's the dynamic when people are making their case, but the goal is to understand rather than to persuade? And how do observers respond to the process, and what are the implications for the protocol itself? So we've been pursuing all of these kinds of questions in our coding. So moving forward, we want to explore the potential to use protocols and processes surrounding them as tools to interrogate teaching and to build professional learning of teachers and other educators. I'm very intrigued by the idea of the kind of structure being useful between teacher and observer administrator, among groups of teachers, and between researchers and educators. In very real ways, what we're trying to do is recapitulate the development process that we go through when we develop these protocols in the first place. We watch lessons, we bring different perspectives, we have exchanges, and we acknowledge uncertainty. All of that ultimately enhances the understanding of everyone who participates in such activities. So what I'd like to do is conclude with the idea that there is a new direction opening up related to observation protocols, with implications for practitioners and researchers alike. This direction calls for using protocols and processes surrounding them as tools to interpret teaching and to build professional learning of teachers and other educators. We need to open up the black box that represents the aspiration that good measures would provide feedback that would improve practice. I really believe we're at a moment we can do that, but we have to do it with intensive and purposeful programs of research and development. To date, our forays into observation protocols have helped us gain a much deeper understanding of teacher quality and classroom interactions, but we've still only made a dent in the area of teacher learning. Observation protocols provide one powerful tool to support what I hope will become an area of research that is robust as all the work that all of you have done and contributed to at the GSE. So thank you.
We do have just a little bit of time for some questions. Those of you who want to stay a little bit after and ask more questions, we can do that, but let's get some questions out. And if people on the Zoom, please either raise your hand or put the question in the chat, and we'll monitor and make sure that our colleagues on Zoom can also chime in. So, questions? Go ahead.
So Drew,
Nora.